Welcome again to Life in the God Lane. I'm Tom West. Hope you'll subscribe to my channel. Give me thumbs up, make comments, hit the bell so you get notified every time I put one of these things out. Share this video with someone else so they can be taught the Bible. That's all we do here is just teach the Bible. And I call this little message the compassion of God. It's from Psalm 103, verse 8. This is for the 24th day of February 2022. A power verse for the day. Remember that King David wrote Psalm 103. David had experienced God in profound ways all through his life. He knew God's forgiveness and grace because he could be a big-time sinner at times. Also a man of deep faith and trust in God and repentance. But he understood the movement of God and the compassion of God. And only David could come up with as complete a way of expressing God's compassion as he did in Psalm 103, verse 8, which we'll read from the New American Standard Bible here. Listen to this. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. Wow. Good old David got it. He understood the nature of God. David describes the compassionate God with four phrases. Number one, he is compassionate. One is compassionate when he identifies with the suffering of another and wants to relieve it. God does that for us. He does that for us in every possible way. God is gracious. Secondly, he looks to extend goodness to others when they don't deserve it. That's how God is gracious toward us. He was gracious that way toward David too. He's gracious toward us that way today. God is slow to anger. I love this. He is slow to anger. One of the great attributes of God, maybe his greatest benefit to us, is that he is slow to get angry. And I think what I've noticed, that anger gets to me fast. The faster things happen, the more likely I am to get angry. And I am not slow to anger. But God is different to me. It's a good thing, you know. He is slow to anger. Why is that? It's because he thinks before he feels. He thinks before he feels. When we feel before we think. That's why we're angry all the time. We feel things before we think. It's good to think before you feel. Act like God, you know. God can find compassion and grace for us because he thinks before getting angry, making him slow to anger. He thinks about us. Fourth, God abounds in loving kindness. His loving kindness overflows. It abounds. He figures out a way to be loving and kind toward us by thinking about us. We don't do too well with that, but he does. In the short book of Jonah, near the end of the Old Testament, God calls Jonah to go preach to Nineveh. And Jonah wants to get away from that, doesn't want to do that. So he jumps on a ship and runs away from God. He heads toward Tarshish is where he heads toward. And he ends up in a storm. They throw him overboard. He's swallowed by a big fish. And inside this fish, he prays to the Lord who made the fish vomit him up on dry ground after 3 days and 3 nights in the fish. And then he responded to the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. And he proclaimed that Nineveh would be judged and overthrown by God. Nineveh repented and turned to God. And God relented from the calamity that he was going to bring on Nineveh. He changed his mind about what he was going to do to Nineveh. Look at Jonah 4, verse 2. Jonah's praying. And he prayed to the Lord and said, "Please, Lord, was not this what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish. For I knew that thou art a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity." Jonah's upset with God. And it's the reason he left and tried to get away, because he knew that God would let Nineveh off the hook if they repented. He didn't like that program. And that's what God did. He knew that God was, listen, this is how he puts it. He knew that God was gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, and abundant in loving kindness. Folks, 1,000 years after Psalm 103, God did it again by sending his son, Jesus, to the cross to take our place and pay the price for our execution, for our sin on the cross. God had compassion on us. The compassion of God. Folks, he loves us and he's compassionate toward us. I will see you tomorrow.